Okay. Hi and welcome to this session about Xamarin. And this will be a session about Xamarin right now and a little bit of a history, but it will mostly focus on the future. What are in preview now and what will become stable in the closest month. Um, my name is Daniel Hindrikes. I'm working for 1337 as a ninja and working mostly with app development using Xamarin. And I have developed apps with Xamarin since around 2012. How many here are Xamarin developers or have developed some apps with Xamarin? A few of you. Then you know that much has happened the latest years. If you remember when Xamarin was new, or even before it was called Xamarin, they have a lot of problem with tooling. There were updates every week, sometimes 3 times a day. The first one fixed something, the other one breaks something, and then the third one fixed something again. So, but much of that changed when Microsoft acquired them. Now they are still releasing things often, but not that often. They focus more on stability and quality in their releases. But we can take a little look about some important things that happened in the Xamarin history. The first version was released back in 2009 somewhere. It was called MonoTouch. And it was created by a guy, Miguel de Casa, Nat Friedman, and Joseph Phil. They are the 3 founders of Xamarin. And they have worked together with Mono. You probably know Mono. It's the open source implementation of .NET. And when Novell acquired Mono, they more or less closed the Mono project. But Miguel and Nat continue to work with an iOS version of Mono, and they wrapped all the iOS APIs so you can use them with C#. So they worked with that for about 2 years. In 2011, they started the company Xamarin, and they also released Xamarin.Android, or Mono for Android, or Monodroid was it called earlier too, but it was released together with that Xamarin was founded. And MonoTouch changed name to Xamarin.iOS. You can still see Mono for Android and MonoTouch in some references. And in 2012, they also released Xamarin for Mac. In 2013, they acquired a Danish company that have a product for testing mobile devices on mobile apps on real physical devices. That's what became the Xamarin Test Cloud. And in 2014, they released Xamarin.Forms. I think many people, when they talk about Xamarin, think that Xamarin is Xamarin.Forms, but that's not true. Xamarin is the platform that Xamarin.Forms is built on top of. And in 2015, Microsoft acquired Xamarin. A lot of things changed. They, for example, open sourced both Xamarin.Forms and the Xamarin platform. One fun history about that is when we was at Build 2015, I think it was. On a party, we met one of the founders, Joseph Phil. I asked him, when will you release Xamarin.Forms open source? Because much of the time you want to do customizations, you use the .peak, for example, for decompile the code and see how they have created the renders. And his answer about if they're going to open source, it's never going to happen. 1 year later, on the same conference, Microsoft announced that they will open source it. So things can change fast. But we will not talk so much about the history now, so we will continue with the news in tooling. The upcoming version of Visual Studio 2019, both for Windows and Mac, because the Mac also has the same name right now. If you take a look at the version numbers, there are different. This will be Visual Studio for Mac 8.0, and this will be 16 on Windows. But the official name is Visual Studio 2019 on both platforms. One big thing, at least on Windows, they have reduced the workload for Xamarin. Before, when you install Xamarin in Visual Studio 15.9, it was around 15-16 gigabytes of installation files. Now it's only 7.69 gigabyte. Probably they removed a lot of strange Android stuffs. And if you compare with the 15.7 version of Visual Studio, the workload is now 3 times less. So, but with focus on the news, Android Designer have historically not been that good in Visual Studio. It was not good in Eclipse either, but it's much better if you have used Android Studio, for example. But the Visual Studio and Microsoft is working to catch up with Android Studio. They have a lot of improvements in the 2019 version. For example, you can drag and drop things much easier. How they show the SAML version. You can use, not SAML, XML when we're talking about Android. You can have side-by-side designers and code, and you have highlighting of what colors you're using and things like that. So that's new. And if you're a Xamarin.Forms developer, you can now use the SAML property editor. If you have worked with other SAML flavors, for example, for Windows development, you're probably comfortable with the property editor. And that will be introduced in Xamarin.Forms. I have only seen this on the Windows version of 2019 right now, but if you take a look at the roadmap, it will also be released in the stable version of Visual Studio for Mac. If you have used Xamarin.Forms for a while, you know that IntelliSense for Xamarin.Forms not has been that good. In the beginning, you don't even had IntelliSense. For a couple of releases ago, Visual Studio for Windows introduced the same SAML engine that you had for UWP, so the IntelliSense has been much better. But now, with the latest release of IntelliCode, together with Visual Studio 2019, you can even use IntelliCode. And IntelliCode is AI-driven machine learning. They're using machine learning for better IntelliSense, and you can even train that on your own code now. In the beginning of IntelliCode, it was just trained on a huge number of GitHub repositories. But you can now use that for Xamarin.Forms as well, but IntelliCode is not available for Visual Studio for Mac yet. I don't know when it will come. When I asked Microsoft about it, they said they have other focuses they think are more important for Visual Studio for Mac. But if you look at the roadmap, they have promised to improve the IntelliSense for SAML, even for Visual Studio for Mac, but not the AI-driven yet. Okay, let's talk about the fun stuff. Xamarin.Forms. We will take a few of the look at the few features that have been released in the latest version. For example, we have the title view. Before, you can only be able to set the text or a string as title, and if you wanted to have images or other controls in the title, you have to create custom renderers. But introduced in Xamarin.Forms 3.5, you can set it directly in your SAML. Just use the navigation page .title view property, and you can put whatever you want in it. For example, here's a stack layout that contains an image and a label. And you can even add touch interactions to it. Xamarin.Forms 3.5 is not released in stable yet, but it's the upcoming version. And it also contains all of the code for Xamarin.Forms 4, of some reasons I don't know. But if you use feature flags, you can even use the Xamarin.Forms 4 things in 3.5. But one of the greatest news in Xamarin.Forms 3.5, I think it's very, very big for me, because how many here has created repeater views for Xamarin.Forms? Yeah, me too. In every project, there are some sort of repeater views based on, for example, stack layout or flex layout. But with bindable layout, you don't have to do that anymore. I will show you the code for it. And that makes it possible to add binding to all layouts. You should probably not use it on a grid because it will be strange, but for a stack panel, a stack layout, for example, it will help you a lot. It's not recommended to use for a long list, for example, because list view have much better performance while you have recycled elements and things like that. But for small lists, you maybe have 2 or 3 rows, but you don't know how many rows it will be. It's perfect. Or if you have some collections you inside a list view, you don't want to use list views in list views. Then you will have a really strange behavior. That will be perfect to use the bindable layout. So let's dive in here. Is it okay, or should I make it? I should make it bigger. Is it better, or should I make it even bigger? Okay. So what you can do here is you can use an attached property, bindable layout.item source. That is the connection to your the binding to your view model. So in this case, I have a collection with podcasts. Then I just need to add an item template. And I will do it like this, bindable layout.item template, and then I will just define my template, a data template. And it can contain whatever I want. In this case, I just binding the name. So let's run this. You can see here the result of it, and if you add more items, it will automatically appear, because one of the most advanced things when you create your own repeated view is you need to handle what type of collection the developer will use. Because if you have a observable collection, you need to handle the collection changed event. If you have a list view, you need to handle that in another way, because it's a lot of code to write that you will get automatically from Xamarin.Forms right now. Since at least since the 2.0 release of Xamarin.Forms, there have been a lot of focus on stability and performance, because performance was maybe not the strength of Xamarin.Forms in the beginning. I remember the first big app I wrote with Xamarin.Forms. We have a lot of list views for both iOS and Android, but we had to replace every single list view with platform-specific control just to get the performance. But later we rebuilt that app, someone around 2.5 release of Xamarin.Forms, and now we using all list views with Xamarin.Forms, because the performance has been so much better, and you have been able to use recycling of elements and so on in Xamarin.Forms list views. But in Xamarin.Forms, it's time for new features. Much things you have learned about how to structure a Xamarin.Forms app will change. Of course, everything you learned about build a page, things that you can use it, but they added something, how they will structure pages, how navigation is used, have changed. These have not changed, they added an option, because you can still use the old way with navigation pages and so on. But what they have introduced is something they call shell. And I will show you how it will look. So if we go to my app.xaml.cs, we can see here, instead of setting a navigation page or a tab page or a master detail page, I instead have my main shell. And the main shell will define how the app will look, how the navigation will be, how the structure will be, how the menus, tabs, and so on. So let's open the main shell. So here you can see we have as a base class is a shell, And we have shell item, and we have shell content, and so on, and shell sections. Every shell item here, if we're using shell item, we don't have to use shell item, but if we do, every item here will be an item in a flyout, or a master detail page that it was called before. So if you run this, we will now have this menu that we can use to navigate for. Some of the things that I don't think was that good with master detail page, it was a little bit advanced to handle the navigation, how to change between different detail pages. It was a little bit complex. If you use my navigation helper, it would be easier, but it was still a little bit complex. So the only thing you need to do here is you can add shell item and shell item. That will be a page. You don't have to define a page, but you can also add a menu item if you only want to have a menu item that doesn't or a page. So you can, for example, add a menu item, set the text, my menu, and then you can, for example, add a command binding in to the view model, or you can add a clicked event. So it doesn't have to be a page behind a menu item. And you can see inside of my first shell item here, the home option, I have a shell content. And every shell content I adding to a page will be a tab. So here I will have 5 tabs in my application just by defining shell content. I don't have to add a tab page. And this makes it easier to define different layouts, for example, on different pages. Here, for example, the layouts can be the main navigation, the tabs can be the secondary navigation. And one other thing that is pretty nice that they've added to this is this content template. If you define the page as a content template, it will load asynchronously. It will only load when you click the item. Before with tab page, it often loaded all the pages and use all the resources for it. But you can also do that now if you want, but then you will do it in this way instead. Both of these options will show the page in the tabs, but if you do like this, it will be loaded when your app starts, or at least when this page is loading. So in many cases, it's preferred to use the content template and tell the app in this way what page to show. And if you open the app again, you can see we had a header here as well. And you can define that header by using this shell.flayout header template and make a data template inside here, so you can define and design your flyout the way you want it. And you can also add bindings, for example, for shell items. You can add icons and customize the design. But you can also see here in this shell item, I have a shell section. You maybe noticed that when I changed here to this page, you also have like tabs up here. It's not very often used in iOS apps, for example, but if you're using the Outlook app, you have seen this. And before you have a navigation page for handling all navigation, you have a navigation stack behind that. But that's removed if you're using shell. You can still use it if you want, but not together with shell. Instead, they have a URL-based navigation. So you will define a route for pages, and you also need to define a route host under the default scheme. But you don't have to use that later. You just have to set it the root scheme you will use, but you will not. You don't have to use the root host if you don't want to. It's an easier way. But for example, here on the shell item, I can define the root to be home, and I can on the shell content also set the root to about, and then I can use it in the navigation. Let's see here. For example, on this page I had added a button that will navigate to the about page, and then I will do this in this way. I need to access the shell. I don't like the way they have implemented, because you don't want to read the main page from the app file and cast it to a shell, but they probably will make it easier or better. And right now you can only go to a page. You cannot open a modal, for example, but there are issues on GitHub, for example, to add modal support and things like that. But right now you will use the go to async method, and you will specify the URL. For example, if you go back here to the home view, you can see the shell. You can see the root. The root on the root is demo. The root for the shell item is home, and the root for this shell content is about. Then the URL will be demo/home/about. So let's try to run this. So I can click this button to navigate, and I will be on the about page. If you plan to write a new app, I guess you know, thinking about, should I use shell or should I use the old way? I would say use the old way right now, because there are a lot of bugs in shell. For example, if you define a custom route that you also can do, it will not work. If you're using CSS styling with shell, it will not work. And if you go to the GitHub and issues list, there are a lot of bugs on shell on all of the other Xamarin.Forms 4 features as well. So I should say wait with Xamarin.Forms 4 features if you're building a real production app. I talked to David Ortino in my podcast App in the Cloud a couple of weeks ago. He said that if you will build an app that you will release in a half year or in a year, you probably should look at Xamarin.Forms 4. But I'm not that sure that he is about that. Wait and see when it will be stable instead. But the plan that he said to me, it would be released in stable version in a couple of months. But yeah, I don't know. There are still a lot of bugs. But I think this is a great way to handle the structure of a Xamarin.Forms because it could be a little bit complicated before, and this will make things faster and will be easier in many ways. So it's a good intention, and I guess they released it to get feedback from the developers on it. So I definitely think that you should play with it, but not for a production app, for a real app. One other new feature of Xamarin.Forms 4 is the collection view. And the collection view is intended to replace list view. List view will not be removed from Xamarin.Forms because of backward compatibility, but it will be much more flexible than the list view. It will also be much faster, because one of the reasons for that they have removed the view cell, because before every item in a list you need to have a view cell that wrapped all the content, and you will have the data template inside of that. But now they removed that, and it will be at least one thing less for them to render. And even if they recycle elements, they could see just to remove the view cell increase the performance a lot. And it will be easier for developers. Less code is also great. But with list view, you only have a vertical, simple list. With collection view, you can have different layouts. You can add columns to it. You can have a horizontal list, for example. What I miss right now is the option to have a wrapping list, wrapping grid, because if you change the orientation, for example, on the app, you maybe want 10 items in a row, and if you change it to portrait, you will have only 2. But that's not supported right now. But you can at least specify how many columns or rows you will. So if you take a look here, how to specify the layout, we'll use the items layout property, and we can set different layouts. For example, here, if you want to have a classic list layout, we can use the list items layout, but we can also change this to be horizontal. It will not look nice in my example, but I will show you that it's possible. So now we instead have a horizontal scroll for this list view. And if you want to use this as a grid, we will use a grid items layout. It will look like this in this example. One thing we often do when we have list views is to handle if the list is empty. You will need to add a lot of wrapping controls, and you need to set is visible and handle all of that. But with collection view, we have a property, this is empty view, that you can define how you want it to look when the list view or the grid has no items. You don't have to write the logic to see if it's empty or not. You just use the collection view.empty view property, and you can define it in that way you want. Otherwise, it's very similar to list view. The only difference, you just have the data template in the item template property. You don't have to use the view cell. One other new feature that they will introduce with the Xamarin.Forms 4 is visual, and that makes it possible to set a theme. You can say a theme, for example, for controls or for pages. The first theme they have made available in this preview is material design. So you can set material design even for your iOS apps. I don't know why someone want that, but they say that many developers wanted that, so that's why they have built that feature. They will probably introduce more themes or design paradigms later. For example, Cupertino, that is the iOS design language, Fluent design that Windows have maybe. I think they will listen to the developers a lot there, what they want. But to use visual, you can set the visual property, for example, on the content page. Or you can set it on an individual control. Visual material. And then you can see the difference between the entries. Here you have the standard iOS layout or design on it, and here you have a more Android-like input control. But you can also set it on the content page, as I said, visual, and it will affect all supported controls on the page. Now I'm using live samples, so we will get a live update You can see all entries are changed, and even the button is changed to a materials style. Do you think this will be useful? I like to have iOS to look like iOS, and I want Android to look like Android. But some people, some developers, some companies want the apps to look exactly the same on all platforms. I think they maybe can build a web app instead. But that's just me. How many are using carousel views in their apps? Have you found a good carousel view for Xamarin.Forms? There are a few good out there, but the most of them have a problem with they're not updated that often, and some of the projects it's not maintained anymore. Xamarin themselves have tried a few times to build a good carousel view. In the beginning, they have the carousel page that is probably in the Xamarin.Forms right now as well, but I don't think anyone uses that anymore. But that was a full page carousel. And they also released a carousel view for there was an external NuGet package that you had to install. But if you take a look at that, they haven't updated for a couple of years. But now they have created a new carousel view that is part of Xamarin.Forms core. So you don't have to install and separate NuGet packages just for the carousel view. And it's based on the collection view, so it will have some of the great features from collection view. For example, it will recycle elements, and you will have the option to set different layouts and so on. So I have a demo for that as well. So we have a carousel view. We'll set item source for binding. We will probably set the height request for it. And we can see here I have items layout, and I'm using the grid items layout. And here we can also add snapping points and snapping points types. And after that, we only need to define an item template. Right now, in the preview version, it's only working on Android. If you're trying to run this on iOS app, you will get an exception that says invalid cast exception, and you don't know why it's not working. If you don't have read the documentation about 4 or 5 times, it took 4 times for me to find it why it doesn't work. But the reason was that it was just supported on Android. So let's run this on Android instead. And here you can see how shell will look on Android. We have, for example, we'll have a hamburger menu, and otherwise it will be pretty similar. Of course, you can add icons to the tabs as well, but I haven't done that for this demo. So let's go to carousel page. We nicely swipe between those 2 items. To use Xamarin.Forms for features, you need to set feature flags, because they don't wanted this to disrupt your daily work. And as I said, you can use this even in Xamarin 3.5 because it's on the same branch. So if you go to my app delegate or my main activity for the Android project, we can see that I have set a few flags with this Xamarin.Forms set flags method. Don't use set flags multiple times because it will overwrite the values every time. So instead, write all your flags like this, because this is a param type of argument with flags. So for shell, you need to set shell experimental, collection view experimental, and for visual experimental. So that's what you have to do to use Xamarin.Forms for features. And it will be exactly the same on both iOS and on Android. But as I said, this is nothing you should use for a production app. For example, you will get a lot of strange behaviors on Android about background colors. If you don't set colors on the items, it will be transparent. It's not enough to set colors on a page, a background color for a page. You have to set it on the root element on the page, because otherwise it will be transparent and it will be a mess. And they have problem with paddings and things like that. So, but it's fun to play with, but don't use it for production apps. If you don't want to learn more about Xamarin.Forms and up to the Xamarin.Forms 3.4, me and the strange guy there has written a book about Xamarin.Forms that you can buy on packedpub.com or Amazon. For example, it's available both as an ebook and as a paperback. And it will be 7 projects about how to build 7 different apps from file new to more or less a finished app. And it will also be a chapter how to get started with Xamarin, how to set up a development machine, and things like that. Any questions? Yeah. The question is if it will support deep navigation. I think they intend to do it, but I think you need to set up that for the platform as well. It will probably be easier because you can use the same navigation schemes. Yeah, it will be easier for the manager. Yeah, but you still have to add that to the info pay list and things like that to get it work from the outside world. If there are no more questions, I don't have anything more. You can contact me on Twitter, LinkedIn, for example, if you have questions later. Thank you for coming.